It still says live in 1 hour, 7 minutes.
Is there a way, Darren, for you to see what's coming up or upcoming on our page?
No.
No? Maybe, could you look up, Darren, how to share your event?
What about right now? What's going on? You sure?
Maybe do a refresh.
Is it live? Okay, so publish means that it goes live. Yeah, that's it.
Cool.
Okay, so it's currently live now. So now it should be live again. I just want to see if that changed, does the thing change? Yeah. And so I walk over there. Am I on the internet?
No.
Not yet?
Not yet.
There's about a 10-second delay.
Oh yeah?
Yeah.
It says you're watching.
Yeah.
Okay. Alright, so okay, hi, I'm Conrad. This is Aggregate Space Gallery. Welcome to iWash 3. Just a few quick things. Pizza is in the back. Bar is to your right. Restroom is down the hallway under the stairs. Willis is in the back to answer questions. I'm going to be sitting kind of running tech right here. And without further ado, here's Christoph Steiger to introduce.
All right. Thanks, Conrad. Hi everyone. I'm Christoph Steger. Myself and Meg Bissonier, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, are the organizers, curators behind the iWash series, which is a collaboration that's run between Aggregate Space, Gallery and now officially the California College of the Arts, where both Meg and I teach in animation and fine arts and any number of related disciplines. So iWash, those of you who have not been here before, iWash is a new series of experimental animation screenings, conversations. The idea really is to kind of create an ongoing platform and a community where a particular kind of animation work that doesn't get much exposure in the traditional or in the more commercial popular channels can be seen and also talked about. And this is our third one in this series. We've had Laura Haidt from Portland here in the fall, and we had a special program on documentary animation with the film historian Jeffrey Scholar from UC Berkeley in February, I think. And tonight I'm so excited to introduce Peter Burr, who's just off the plane from New York City to give a presentation of his own work, give us some insight into his practice. Peter's work is really unique and outstanding, and I would say instantly recognizable, and has been. I would say Peter's had really a stellar career over the past couple of years, and it's just been going from Creative Capital grants to shows at MoMA PS1, involved in Documenta 14, Richmond, ICA Richmond just now, and has just been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship. So, big deal. Awesome. So yeah, without further ado, welcome Peter, and
so among all the things that Christoph mentioned, I just finished completing a new piece that's premiering tomorrow at the ICA at VCU in Richmond, Virginia. I've been working on this specific manifestation of this project pretty full on for the last 9 months, and so I thought it would be interesting for me, and I have some friends in the audience who know my work already, that this would be an interesting opportunity to kind of reflect on, not exactly a postmortem, but to kind of dig up some of the ideas that made their way into that project. This piece is part of a much larger project that I'll also talk about, that I've been working on with the game designer and writer and artist Porpentine Charity Hardscape. You'll see some of her writings tonight. Yeah, I guess sort of as Christoph said, over the past few years, my work took a real turn from what I've been doing for the previous 10 years when I lived out here on the West Coast. Lately, I've been really interested in using video game tools that are part of the video game industry and make interactive work to make animation and to explore the kind of fringes and the boundaries of that. And so, so I'll talk a little bit about the way that I think about that and how that ends up in these sort of strange hybrid projects. But kind of where I wanted to start before I got into that, I think today will take maybe about an hour. If you guys have any questions, feel free to raise your hands during or after the presentation. If anybody in the back can't hear me, just shout out, because I'll be sitting here, so my voice might get swallowed a bit. You're good. So I want to start off by showing a piece that I made about a year ago with a person who's become a pretty close collaborator of mine, the artist Mark Fingerhut. Originally, I started working with him as a programmer in Unity when I first started playing around with this game engine. And we teamed up with my sound designer, John Also Bennett, who's in a band called Forma, to make a piece called Descent. I guess one of the reasons I'm interested in starting off with this project is because it's not explicitly a video, it's actually an executable file, and so it's interesting to kind of perform that to kind of warm things up. So what you'll be seeing when I launch this executable file, you'll actually see my desktop operating in the background, and you'll see these rats kind of infesting my computer as this piece plays for about 7 minutes. So that piece, Descent, I guess for a long time I've been wanting to make work explicitly inspired by Peter Bruegel the Elder's huge body of drawings and paintings. This will be a theme that kind of runs through tonight, my interest in drawing and painting as like a catalyst for moving image work. But I've been working on this project for years now about, I guess it's sort of the title of tonight's talk, The Infinite Death Labyrinth. But for better or for worse, a couple years ago when we had a new president elected, and it was a very psychedelic time for me to think about how I related to my society, how I thought of how that felt, but also how I thought about that in terms of a larger history. Making a piece that was about a plague and the sort of social upheavals around that was very cathartic. But I digress. We'll shift gears and talk about Death Labyrinths. So I think this part of the presentation will probably just last about 20 minutes or so. And then there are two films that I want to show you guys at the end of this presentation that come from this body of work. But as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, for a number of years I've been collaborating with the game designer and writer Porpentine charity Heartscape. And we've been building this world together that this project Dirt Scraper emerges from, that I'll talk about a bunch today. The very first thing that Porpentine and I worked on together was actually this image feed where I amassed a huge collection of images of kind of contemporary labyrinths. I spent a number of years researching the visual archetype of the labyrinth and thinking about like manifestations that resonated, that were both historically oriented but also felt somehow fresh or poignant. And this is a little piece of writing that acted as this catalyst for this entire project that I'll read. So this is about the infinite death labyrinth. In video games, there's a concept of an infinite dungeon, an endlessly regenerating death labyrinth. There's an intimate quality to a structure that remakes itself after each horrible demise and invites you to try again. Dungeons are the study of structures as living things. Their diet is your curiosity, and their luring plumage is gold and gems. There's another kind of labyrinth, a zone that has been subtly, horribly altered by something beyond human understanding. It has a set of strange rules that must be understood to survive. In this zone, the opposite of survival is not death, it is change. I like the word zone because maze feels so architecturally prescriptive. After all, the prayer labyrinth proves that the walls of a maze are not its defining characteristic. The zone is vague like God is vague. It's whatever you want it to be. It doesn't give a shit about you. The zone is feral architecture, city aesthetic, jungle biology. The zone is an infinite hallway or claustrophobia under an open sky. The zone is full of monsters. Thank God.
Did you write that?
Porpentine with that. And that kind of, part of the conversations that came out of that prompt, that poem, I had just finished a project called Special Effect that was inspired by a film by Andrei Tarkovsky, whose film was inspired by a book by the Strugatsky brothers. Roadside Picnic was the book, Stalker was the film. And in both the book and the film, there's this space called the zone that is pregnant with a lot of mystery. There's a lot of high status. In the book, in the film, they deal with that space really differently, and I use that as like a jumping off point to explore my own sense of that. And out of that project, I started getting interested. That project basically ended up being a 90-minute cinema performance. When I finished it, I was thinking a lot about how to translate something that was alive and not so single channel into an archive, into something that could exist without me. And that got me thinking about video games. And that was when I discovered this term, generative death labyrinth. And I sort of think about this term really liberally, but maybe this is neither here nor there, but it's something that I think about a lot as I try to connect my work into this body of, or this history of video games. I'm not a really avid gamer, but I find it to be a really interesting medium, and the history is obviously really inspiring. So just to kind of break down the notion of the generative death labyrinth, in video games. It's just the idea that it's generative, so it uses rules to generate a surface form from underlying abstract structures. It makes use of character permadeath, so it's kind of like real life. It's not like Mario so much. It takes place in a contained environment, a labyrinth. And part of, I guess, what I started to get really excited about as I started exploring what has been happening in independent game development over the past decade. I kind of stopped playing video games in the late 90s when I went to art school and came back to it. Was this idea of an emergent narrative, the emergent narrative potential of game worlds like this. And this refers to situations in games that emerge from the interactions of relatively simple game mechanics to result in some sort of sequential meaning, narrative, or story. And I find that to actually be a really liberating thing to think about as I'm making my moving image work. Now I'm going to digress a bit because I want to kind of stick to the theme of this talk around the form of labyrinths. And thinking a bit about that initial genesis of this project that's called Aria N, this project that I've been thinking about as a video game for a number of years with Porpentine. As I was amassing all these images, I became really attracted to a handful of what I felt like were these labyrinth architects or labyrinth designers, and so I want to just talk about a few of them here tonight. What we're looking at are some etchings of the artist Giovanni Piranesi. Is there anybody here that's never heard of Piranesi? New to some people? He inhabits like a lot of strange sectors of culture. He was an Italian artist who lived in the 18th century. During his youth, it has been written that he really wanted to become an architect, but he didn't really gain much traction there. But he was this really skillful, really talented artist with a copper plate making etchings. And he became really well known for his highly detailed etchings, mostly of ruined architecture in Rome. He traveled a lot and made these etchings, some of them diagrammatical, but a lot of them a bit more romantic. But one influential series of work that I became really attracted to is called his Imaginary Prisons, Le Carceri. In this body of a dozen or 2 dozen etchings, which he actually made a couple of versions of, he envisioned a collection of these imaginary prisons that really defies any logical actual architectural space. So they're these invented indoor kind of prisons or dungeons. And one thing that I found really interesting about his work is it predates somebody like M.C. Escher, who's using the same form of invented architecture as an image by 150 years. And there's obviously a very different sensibility to it because he's very pre-modern. But I found it to be a really interesting place to gain some inspiration from. So another group, Artogram, this is a group of a few different architects and artists in the UK in the 60s. We're zooming ahead 200 years now. We're going to be talking about these labyrinth architects, these architects, designers, artists, whose 2D work I'm really attracted to. And Artogram, they were an avant-garde architecture group in the 1960s, and they were, many of them did actually practice architecture, but as this group, they primarily exhibited in an art context, and so they actually printed publications and had art exhibitions to kind of propose these notions of different architectural ideas. And here on this slide, I just included a few of them. There's the plug-in city, which you see sort of on the left side of this slide. And in this idea, this is a project they came up with in 1964. They proposed this megastructure where there's actually no buildings. It's just a massive framework into which cell-like dwellings can be slotted. And this proposal frames the people that live inside as basically just this raw material to be processed through the city's machinery. And they were not actually being critical. In a way, Artogram was very buoyant art collective that was interested in this optimistic and thinking about advertising aesthetics and pop culture to try to integrate very optimistically into their projects. They insisted very frequently that people are meant to enjoy their experience in a place like this plug-in city. The Walking City is perhaps what I think of as their most well-known project. This was also sort of proposed in 1964. And in this project, people lived in these intelligent pods that could actually roam cities. The pods are all independent, but they could plug into way stations to exchange occupants or replenish resources. So they're starting to parse out these notions while they're dealing in architecture and dealing in pop culture. They're starting to think about cities as these organisms. And then Instant City, which we see on the top, these balloons. This one I find, I struggle with this because while I can definitely remember being really excited about this work, their proposal essentially borrows from advertising aesthetics to build these instant cities, these cities that can come into, as they described, like drab, underdeveloped towns, to instantly turn them into these provisional performance spaces, spaces of spectacle, and then leave behind some sort of infrastructure so that you could potentially do that again. And this, of course, reminds me a lot of my upbringing in the 80s, going to indoor shopping malls. And I guess to kind of zoom back and think a bit about the notion of the zone, or this place that has a high status, this zone that's been cordoned off and potentially abandoned. These sorts of sites, I'm really interested in as a way to examine, I guess, the byproduct of these rationally constructed spaces, kind of the friction of what happens when an artist is actually given the opportunity to be a city planner, or to be an architect, to actually have a bit more power than just creating images. One thing that I've been, I have no way to really verify this in my lived experience, but I've heard that actually only 2% of the built environment is actually built by architects. And I find that tension really interesting. So the third architect that, and this is, I would say, perhaps like a primary inspiration for some of the work I've been doing over the past few years, is artist named Paulo Soleri. I actually brought this book, if anybody wants to look at it, all the way from New York. My not allowed to have carry-on bag, I snuck it in there. If anybody wants to look at it, I find this book to be just such a gem. Paulo Soleri was an artist who was also working around the same time as Archigram in the 60s. He became a key figure in this sort of like modernist-influenced architect because he actually started to build one of his conceptual buildings. He coined the term arcology, which is a portmanteau. It fuses the word architecture with ecology. So unlike Archigram, he was very much thinking about the environmental impact of his designs and how there could be this potential sustainable reality. But as I mentioned, he actually started to build one of these spaces, and you can visit this place in the Arizona desert. It's called Arcosanti. My experience of, actually, I visited there, I spent about a week there last year with a group of filmmakers and friends doing a project. And I found it really interesting that, so Soleri died a few years ago, and Arcosanti, there hasn't been a construction project there for about 20 years, and it's said that it's about at 4% completion. And I actually find that to be potentially like a really interesting way to actually work towards or to achieve to manifest a real utopia. If you always keep it radically unfinished, it's always in this state of potential and of becoming. So yeah, I keep learning from Soleri's, his inspirations, then also of course his ego, or the extent to where that vision actually rubs up against cracked concrete and glass. Again, we're hanging out in the 60s. This Super Studio is an Italian art collective that we're kind of gradienting from Archigram, who was very buoyant and optimistic in their proposals, to a group that was, in their own way, they're making images and they're practicing architects, but their work is a bit more overtly critical of modernism. They considered themselves anti-architectural, and they created a lot of these really beautiful publications, films, where they used grid systems and cheap, perfect materials to kind of cynically mediate social and environmental systems. So the last kind of historical labyrinth architect that I'll talk about has drifted us away from, well, Willensley was actually, he studied architecture in school, but he came to prominence by merging his architectural ideas into much more of a fine art context. A dominant body of his work are these sort of like abstract paintings and sculptures. But for the second half of his life, like the last 50 years of his life, he dedicated most of his productive time to developing this project called One City, which we see here. One City is a 675 square mile architectural labyrinth buried in the central North American plains. It's designed as an imaginary city to house the entire population of the United States. And he created this large mythology around it, but I was first attracted to Inslee's work because of some of his grid-like abstractions, that this one city became an opportunity to manifest or to inspire, to explore. So this brings us to, this image was taken about 6 months ago, a year ago, to my own work. And this project called Dirt Scraper that will premiere tomorrow night at the ICA ECU. And this, like a lot of these artists that we just looked at, came from an interest in image making. Crappy printer paper. It says, I live in New York and space is small, so when I draw, I tend to draw pretty small, but I had this big wall. So I was actually building this structure modularly, ostensibly until I got bored with it. And once I had finished constructing a space that felt like it was vast enough to be able to contain like a singular museum experience, at this point when I started drawing it, I knew that this was going to be the site of a museum installation. And so, I mean, thinking realistically, most people that are going to go to a museum to look at this kind of work are going to spend how much time in that room? So I was sort of trying to intuit that. It's not cinema, and I kind of built that space accordingly. Once I had that image, like Super Studio, like Solari, like Artogram, I used that drawing as an opportunity to kind of try to merge that tension between modernist abstraction, these shapes, and human utility, and that was where these stories start to be born. Now I'm going to play a little video. Since I don't have a mic, well, let's see if I can talk over it. Yeah, not so bad. So this is the entire Dirt Scraper. This is going to be a scroll down. The entire piece takes about the length of a feature film to play an entire cycle. And so what we're seeing, this is the initial state of the Dirt Scraper. When you enter at the beginning of a cycle. And there are these texts that Porpentine wrote to kind of frame some of the logics that are, some of the stories and the narratives that happen within that space. Now, we just saw a wipe happen. Now we're about 45 minutes into this simulation of this structure where halfway through the timeline of this story, the regulatory systems that sustain this structure start to take over. They start to assert dominance and start to compete. They play this sort of game of checkers against each other. Of course, there are crowd simulations that are happening. People are still living. There are these narratives that still unfold. But this is the end state. This is about an hour and a half into the project. And one of these AI regulatory systems ends up completely dominating the structure. And this end state, of course, is different every time the cycle plays out. What we're seeing here is the commercial AI faction called Lake has dominated this structure. And so that's why it kind of looks like Reddit Place or some shitty GeoCities website. And then we're just down to darkness. So I mentioned these regulatory systems that sustain and then kind of contribute to some of the dissolution of this structure and the narrative. Now, I'm really interested, as Solari sort of talks about buildings as organisms, Artogram kind of talked about this as well. I'm really interested in this idea of buildings that potentially live and breathe, and human beings are kind of just the soft stuff inside. We're kind of like instrumentalized in that way. I like thinking about buildings this way, and with Dirt Scraper, I used that as an opportunity to invent these regulatory systems with Porpentine. We came up with these 4 artificial intelligences. We have R up in the upper left, and you can see some of these I guess thumbprints of this AI are these industrial thumbprints, the things that actually sustain the ventilation systems and the sewage in this building. On the upper right, you see Cell, which is the AI that regulates recreational systems, verdant space. lower left, we have Lake, which we've already talked about. And in the lower right, we have Nix, who's the AI of residential space. I'm kind of glossing over this because this kind of complicated mix of systems plays out over the course of an hour and a half, where these AIs, this game of chess or checkers where they compete for dominance over this structure, overlays with some stories of the people that are actually living inside. And so over the course of this piece, we actually get, there's this kind of like boredom engine when people aren't actually touching and moving through the space on their own for a certain amount of time. We fade out into this sort of cinematic sequence that shows us close-ups of the inhabitants. Here we see an image of one of the planners that lives in the dirt scraper, and these people are the people who actually designed and built this space. And after the mess, after this kind of dissolution occurs, they mainly sort of masturbate within their own models and diagrams and reports of this space.
Is it always the same when it runs, or does it generate and change with each plan? When you say it's an hour and a half,
Yeah,
it's always the same story? Or
so what were these like cinematic scenes that happen? There's about 50 of them that run over the course of that hour and a half that we come back to. And that kind of functions like a spine. So the same way that I construct a film, I've constructed this spine that's not like shuffling. I haven't quite let go of that level of control yet. What does play out in a kind of generative emergent space is when we're in that elevation view, the dissolution of that building that started off as a drawing gets overtaken by these systems. And that generates different fragments of text that reveal themselves, and of course different arrangements of space.
and that's different with each iteration?
That part is, yeah. So there's this didactic quality, and as somebody who's coming from a film background and playing with this technology, it's like I'm really not interested in making. I mean, video games are tricky for me because as I like learn and read about them and play them, there's clearly like a really dominant element of kitsch in video games. They're like market driven. There are like rules for how to make a good game, and in a way you can think about film that way as well. But I always try to like hang out on the outskirts of that so that I don't, I guess, get distracted by this idea of like what you're supposed to do. So we kind of like, we saw some images of the residents that live inside the dirt scraper. The last image was of the worms, or these squatters, people that over the course of this simulation build their own structures within it, these micro-dwelling pods called worm cubes. And here we see a little vignette that shows one of the remediators that come in to clean up the mess. So they're just hired. This is a job for them to, when this mess occurs, this AI malfunction and graffiti starts to fuck up this space, this complex commingling of chaos, the remediators are brought in to kind of remedy this space. And so I'm going to actually use this as an opportunity to zoom out a little bit, because what we see here is an image of, off in the distance, the protagonist of this story that I've been working on at Corporate for a long time, a woman named Arya End, who is a custodian who's been tasked with cleaning up this structure. And I've been thinking with Porpentine of Arya End as this video game, and Dirt Scraper and a couple of other projects have been these ways to stretch out the development period. Making a video game takes a long time, and so I've been trying to honor the fact that I come from a really different discipline and make these museum pieces and these films that come from that. Let's see, I guess before I talk specifically about any of those individual projects, I'll talk a little bit about Arya, because she really is. She's like, in the game version of this, she's going to be the protagonist of this story. And we'll see a film called The Mess, where you get to get inside her a little bit. But Arya has this rubberized artificial gut called Stoma, the serotonin tracking orifice management application. Stoma mediates all the information that Arya gathers in the world, and it also functions as the main menu for a player. It also acts as like a sort of intestinal flora-powered internet, so she can communicate with her teammates that are also there to clean up the mess. And I'm interested in the gut as, well, scientifically it's been shown that the gut is actually a second mind. It contains over 100 million neurons. It influences our emotions, and it has its own forms of mental illness. I guess one of the things that really gravitated me towards this metaphor of this structure and thinking about it architecturally was when I was experiencing depression, wanting to be proactive or willful towards it. I ended up taking serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which was interesting, and I used this as an opportunity. I mean, there was catharsis there, but also I found it strange to be engaged in a medical system where the professionals, the practitioners, the doctors weren't really sure what this did. Maybe a fecal transplant would be the way to go. And it made me realize there was this whole opportunity for poetry and for artistic exploration inside this science. Okay, so I'm going to zoom back a little bit out of that material and talk about this aggregate project. So I was out at the ICA in Richmond last week for a sort of soft opening, and I shot this shitty cell phone cam of this piece so you guys can kind of get a sense of the final form of Dirt Scraper. I'm interested in turning this into a piece of home entertainment, so a sort of like game that you can download at home as well as a film. I have enough material to make a feature film, but of course this was like the genesis form. What we see here is an image of the genesis form of this project a few years ago, like 3 years ago. This project called Cave Exits, which is where I first reached out to Porpentine to collaborate on a project together. This is the outside of this video cube in Cave Exits. When people go inside of this video cube, these 4 screens surround them, and so in a way, there's this like, it's not overtly interactive, there's no peripheral. Here the peripheral is your body, your own neck and eyes. You have to actually, because it's a 360-degree environment, these 4 screens are showing different vantage points on this world. In the upper left, we see some of the graphics that are being generated by Stoma. We see some first-person perspectives, we see some cinematic, and of course, the core of Porpentine's writing exists in the lower right-hand corner, this very cognitive, rational perspective on the world. And so this became a way to try to unfold a story in these branching, fragmented paths that ended up becoming a film called The Mess that we'll watch tonight as well. So I did, with all of these projects, I do try to translate them because I'm interested in making this work accessible. One of the difficult things about making a 15 by 30 by 40 interactive installation is that nobody can see it because it's crazy, it's expensive, it's hard. And so I'm always interested in translating this work. This image is of the second work that came out of this collaboration called Pattern Language. And with Pattern Language, this was really, with Cave Exits in the Mess, this was a project that, in a very abstract and large kind of brushstroke sort of way, allowed us to manifest this world and the kind of broader strokes of the world in its totality. With Pattern Language, I really drilled down into something that kind of wanted to be a bit more optimistic for a moment in this project, and so I used Pattern Language to think about some more optimistic architectural philosophies, and that brought me to this book called Pattern Language that is primarily attributed to an architect named Christopher Alexander that describes the aliveness of certain human ambitions through an index of structural patterns. And so Pattern Language is a book. It's a book you can actually buy. I would have brought it, but it's a bit thick. I don't think I would have been able to carry it on. It's actually this encyclopedic index that allows the ideas that people can actually read it and use that to do a better job at designing their own communities, their own buildings, from a windowsill all the way to a city. And I found that to be actually quite inspiring. And so yeah, we'll see a film version of Pattern Language. I also, while this started off as a 180-degree video installation with 7 audio channels and subwoofers underneath your seat that kind of give you an anal seizure and paralyze you in the space, I softened it and I made a cinematic version that we'll watch tonight. So yeah, I guess before I launch into screening mode, does anybody have any questions about any of that? I kind of ripped through everything really fast. Yeah.
I I'm really interested in the sort of labyrinth connecting to the idea of death. I'd like to hear your thoughts on like whether your art is connected to like actual human death or just the general up to interpretation form of death.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of what death is such an abstract idea, right? But it's also very real. I guess part of the reason I showed that slide to talk about generative death labyrinths is because in video games, the notion of coding in permadeath or like permanent player death is a way to imbue some sort of status or importance. There's something actually at stake, and so there's an image that I showed. I'll bring it back up of a game that I actually spent a bit of time playing called Stone Soup, where I never beat this game, but you spend all this time actually like developing this character. These stories play out. In the upper left-hand corner, we see actually a screenshot of Dwarf Fortress, which I think is really the crown jewel of these emergent narratives. There's this kind of poetry that generates from that. But the idea that like everything can go to shit and it just dies and it's just over, I think is a way that helps. If we're going to instrumentalize things, it could be a mechanic that helps us take something seriously or feel that it's important. If I'm to zoom back a few years and thinking about like these metaphors, the labyrinth as a metaphor for ways to explore my own body, my gut, my own mind, these mental spaces, I first started getting into making drawings and doing research around this image in a therapeutic capacity in a way, because I felt like, you know, it's so easy to feel like you're at a dead end, you know, but that's just a construction, right? And there's ways that, in a way, people talk about a labyrinth as a unicursal maze, and that's not necessarily true, but it's this idea that in the kind of prayer labyrinth, there is only one path, and so you don't have to stress out about all these forking paths and dead ends, right? You just go. And I guess there's something that I always found really liberating about really spending a lot of time with that metaphor, with that chaos, in a way that I guess tries to nurture equanimity. Perhaps I'm getting a bit lofty, but there's a lot there. Perhaps we could talk about it outside of the talk. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious about the people that you have in your simulation. How many are there, and what does it have them do?
Here, I'll bring up this video again while I talk about this. So, I mean, perhaps this doesn't do the greatest job, but this will at least create an opportunity where you sort of get a cutaway. So I've actually never counted exactly how many people live in the dirt scraper. That's not like an aspect of this project that I've put a ton of rational thought towards. But you'll see here, as we scroll down it, I think I'm trying to remember, each one of these floors over the course of the 90-minute simulation, I'm actually hand animating populations going up and down as different moments in the story happen. I would say probably functionally that you ever see in a single scroll, not more than a few hundred. Yeah, the idea, just in terms of the mythology of the dirt scraper, is that this is this underground space that was built around this material called endite that sustains the economy of this structure. And on the right-hand side, you actually see some of that material. And so it's actually the site of a mining operation that creates opportunities for class hierarchies to reveal themselves in the actual architecture. And so there's places where there's upper-class residences, there's lower-class residences, there's sort of a Mall of America kind of vibe. There's all these spaces that can contain quite a lot. But to be very pragmatic about numbers, for this museum commission, I knew I wanted to, since it was my first time really making something that would have to live for like 7 months, always on, I actually got got the actual computer from the museum that it was going to be running on to develop in my studio. And so I put as many people in there as I felt like I could before the computer shit the bed. So, you know, perhaps in some speculative future, there will be a lot more there, but for now, there's just a few hundred.
When and where was the dirt scraper exhibited?
So it opens tomorrow in Richmond, Virginia, at a new museum called the Institute of Contemporary Art. Yeah, so you can go see it.
Yeah.
Eventually, my plan is to make a film version so that you can see it in a cinema. But I probably shouldn't say that out loud because then I just jinxed myself. Yeah. Speaking of film versions, perhaps this is a good opportunity to show the mess and pattern language. So the mess is 14 minutes and pattern language is about 10 minutes. So get comfortable. If you're sensitive to flashing lights, this is definitely not the right screening for you. Fair warning. All right. last thing I'll say about pattern language, if any of you guys are going to be in New York at all in May, the Times Square Art Alliance does this project called Midnight Moment, where they give Times Square to an artist for 3 minutes at midnight. And so every night in May, there'll be a version of pattern language that I took out some of the strokey stuff, but it's yeah, thank you guys for coming. I'll be around. If anybody wants to look at this archaeology book, I brought it. It's amazing. And yeah, I'll be hanging out having a beer and some pizza. Yeah, does anybody have any questions that they want to formally ask before we? Yeah.
No, I was wondering, I find it really beautiful, but also painful, having a lot of people. And is it important to you that it should be painful? And is it painful to you? And how do you feel about people who can't watch it at all?
Yeah, I mean, look, I make experimental animation, so if I'm totally used to people not wanting to watch what I make, right? So that's fine. I'm not interested in making work that's physically painful, right? And I understand that like flicker, strobe, it's an acquired taste. It's not necessarily for everybody. I guess part of the thing that attracts me to it is there's this way in which I've been able to reach a point where I just open up to it, and instead of ripping it and trying to pay attention to it, you just take it holistically. There's this way that I find these I think of it as these deeply somatic ways of hearing and seeing, where you're doing it with your body, not so much with your mind. And I feel like the flicker is a way to do that with the projected image. And yeah, I think what I notice is when there are certain artists that employ that mechanism, will have something that they want you to focus on, and they'll do that. And that's kind of mean because that hurts. But there's this way that I try to use it where I think of like a really hardcore spa. I want there to be a relaxing element. Yeah.
At what point in your life would you say that you started to notice this connection between gaming format and sort of this exploration of the psychedelia through from the mind-body experience kind of colliding?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so I went to school in Pittsburgh, I graduated in 2002, and when I went there, that was really the first time that I started using computers in any sort of serious way in terms of art practice. When I got out of university, I started a band with my friend Christopher called Hooligan Ship, and we would curate these animation programs and make these performances and take these shows on tour, sort of an installation performance framing for these film shows. And the work that we made was, very intuitively made it. We're definitely inspired by some of our peers, like my friend Jacob Chiachi. He was in this collective called Paper Rad. When he moved to Pittsburgh, he brought this whole tidal wave of inspiration to me and what I can definitely identify as other people in my community, of a certain sensibility that definitely, Corey Archangel is certainly also part of that, where it's you're dealing with kitsch, you're dealing with just the detritus of this industry that we live in, that we buy, but then we can use the implicit meanings and the implicit strategies to make something else, maybe make it intuitively. And when I used to teach in museums, there was this fun game that I would play as an icebreaker where I would have everybody in the class try to draw the same cartoon character that we all know from memory. And there's something really, this is something that I learned from Jacob, it's something that's really great when you actually, we think that we own Mickey Mouse, but then when you actually try to make it, it's so rough. The mutation that happens is really interesting. And so Christopher and I would work that way, and we would develop these narratives really intuitively, and it felt, I think because we both played a lot of video games, watched a lot of television, it was just for many years when I was doing that project, I thought of my art practice as a way of reversing this fire hose of media that I grew up just give me more. And learning After Effects and the internet becoming what it is now, where you can just steal stuff and maybe that's its own material, you grind pigment and make a painting or something. There was this way that I thought of it. It was very satisfying to make work that use that same stuff but put it outwards. I'm not engaged in that same strategy. None of this stuff is really, I guess there's a bit of appropriation because now when you work in Unity, there's literally one of the windows that you have to turn off if you don't want it. It's a shopping mall, right? It's all infiltrating. But But yeah, I guess it grew organically out of just being like coming of age in the late 90s, early 2000s in the East Coast. Yeah. Cool.
Can you talk about the dystopianism of this stuff? I mean, some of the art institutions seem kind of utopia, even though I know that's the way it went in the 60s,
Yeah.
and you don't buy that.
Yeah.
I guess I've been feeling really dystopian about technology and all this stuff that you see reference and everything. To me, when I think of labyrinths and these underground cities and these people just toiling away at nothing that don't even really matter to what the whole spectacle is, it makes me think about these things.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this project came out of being in like a really depressive headspace, and it's not there anymore. One of the great things about working on a project for many years is it has grown and has transformed. And so there's this way, like looking at Archigram, they're not being dystopian in their plans, but when you look at like the instant city, it's just like I look at that and it's like you're like, this is a good idea that you're going to come into an underdeveloped nation and leave your shit behind. It's just like, it's hard. I mean, especially as like a cis white male, it's hard not to like own that privilege. Like, I have to, right? And so, nonetheless, like, I don't want to hang out in dystopia, right? Like, I know at a certain point I think I did, but where I am now, I don't want to. But at the same time, I don't want to just like rely on the privileges that allow me to just, I got a Guggenheim, cool, I'm gonna go live in Dominican Republic for a year. It's not, it's like, I guess there's a sobriety to trying to find that balance. And in a way, I mean, pattern language, while it's not an overtly optimistic work, it's neutral, maybe at best. That was, like I came at that out of an interest in trying to find balance. And so, yeah, I mean, this project was born out of an interest in the zone, in this like, just devastated environment, in part because that mirrored like an emotional space that I was in, and I guess my hope is that something positive can actually come out of that. I don't want to predetermine it, but like part of my process is just iterating and letting these things develop. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah, I don't know.
Well, have you seen the Fassbender film World on a Wire?
I haven't watched it.
So that's about a virtual world, and at one point they go in the world, and the people are only, there's nothing to do, and they just walk. They just walk like lock their hands in with an ant farm, like people in your. Yeah.
I mean, I definitely, like, through this project, like, Sundance came on to partner in development of it, and when I went to one of their labs, there's definitely this real, like, VR positivism, right? But, like, if you, like, what's the best thing? I mean, I've seen interesting articles about, like, the medical potential of like, burn victims, they're burn victims that can go into a cool world. Like, there are these studies that I find interesting if they work. I haven't experienced that, but like at best, I really think of like a room of people like with helmets on, looking at nothing. Just like it is such a drag, right? Or then like AR. Like the first time I was ever introduced to AR was at like a conference in the Netherlands, and some guy was talking about his great killer app where he showed this video where he climbed this mountain in Switzerland, and it's like, look at the view of the town, look what I can do with my app. And like it showed like Starbucks and McDonald's, and like turned this vista into this garbage. And so it's like I mean, I definitely am equipped to be able to like work with that, but it's hard because all the tools that I'm using are logically pointing towards making garbage. Yeah, so I think that's part of where the dystopia comes from. Yeah.
I have a question, but I was in the bathroom when Q&A session started, so maybe somebody asked about this, but I'm curious about how you work with a musician and who made some music for the film, because what's interesting is that your work visually really stunning, but also the music is doing really a particular thing, and it sounds kind of almost nostalgic in a like Terry Riley kind of music also, but still makes your visual work much easier to experience because the music is kind of wrapping up the whole thing, and then taking us, kind of guiding us almost through through the work. When the visual has so many cuts and difficult flickering and also textures, but the music is really kind of makes it easy to kind of get that visual information. So I'm curious about how you work with musicians.
Yeah, so there's a couple of thoughts that I have there. The first one is that, like, I've always been really interested in collaboration. That's always been really important to me. In part, talking about hooliganship in this band, that was like a framing mechanism for a curated program that I would take on tour. And with special effect, this Tarkovsky-inspired performance, I actually raised money. I did a Kickstarter campaign to hire people to make material that then I could use. And in a lot of ways, when I watch this stuff, like watching The Mess, when you're in certain parts of that architecture, it really looks like I really feel Brenna Murphy's contributions to the project. Or when you're in certain aspects of the Dirt Scraper with all these ads, that was Brendan Wilmar and Eric Carlson who are contributing these things. And so part of my interest in making this kind of work, not being alone with it, is letting other artists do what they do really well. That being said, so all the music that we heard tonight was by John Also Bennett, who's somebody that I've been working with since I moved to New York and stopped working with Christopher, my bandmate. When we were making work together in Portland, we had this philosophy where we would make the music together, we would make the animations together, and we would make the costumes together, and we would iterate. So it wasn't this two-tone, didactic, pipeline, industrial process. We were all doing it all at the same time, and there's this way that I think of the form of the piece is this delicate structure and all the different pressures of the music and the visuals and perhaps the shape of the installation all kind of determine what that final form is going to be. It's not this storyboarded, gridded thing. And so I've come to working with John. John is explicitly the musician now, but I've come with this particular attitude. And because we're friends, we can work together very closely. That Terry Riley kind of reference that you bring out, the arpeggiated sequences in pattern language, when I made pattern language, I was given an opportunity to inhabit a black box theater for 2 months in Lower Manhattan, and I actually installed the 4-channel piece there with speakers. And John would come in once a week. We would just kind of jam out with Mark Fingerhut, my programmer, and I had some ideas, but we built the work together in that space. And at the time, John was first starting to work with this musician named John Gibson, who is one of the original musicians in the Philip Glass Ensemble. And he showed me, he was showing me stuff, we were looking at different references, listening to stuff together, and we were getting somewhere, but nothing was feeling quite right for this section. And then he brought in this piece that was actually a moving image work that Gibson had made that sounded very similar to what that was, and I asked John to make some version of it as some sort of sketch. And when he brought that in, it was just we basically didn't fuck with it after that. It was so it's this iterative process where I really trust John at this point. So we heard it a little bit in the background when I was talking about Dirt Scraper, but he composed 50 fragments of music that are that will come together into a soundtrack, and that's very much his work, and I trust him with that. Yeah.
I was wondering, since something that's inherent with kind of generative things or with games, there's tend to be glitches or some kind of errors, and you kind of, I'm very interested in the aesthetics of maybe glitches, and you use this kind of great visual language. How much I would be interested in hearing your thoughts about incorporating kind of these errors, or is there anything that happens when you generate things and they run into each other?
Yeah, I mean, it's I can kind of connect that to the last question about having this process that's not so structured that you predetermine it when you make it. I can think of at the very late stages of Dirt Scraper, Mark and I built this piece, and we realized, shit, we have to get this thing into Mad Mapper or something so that it can be projected on this wall and can be corner pinned. And the way that we built it in Unity didn't, for technical reasons, we couldn't get everything into it, so we had to kind of rebuild this system. And when we threw it together, there was this kind of jitter that happened on all those text boxes because we put them so close to the camera and world space that we could have fixed really easily, but it was actually that nastiness, I thought, merged. It was just a nice accident that we could keep because there's no boss, right? We're just making the work. And so it's things like that that are really great. On the contrary, with the pathfinding algorithm that's sort of determining the different states of the crowd flow, we actually worked really hard so that when people are walking and they get stuck on each other, that they don't get stuck for too long. Because I actually don't like how that looks. And so we make, if people get stuck for like 2 or 3 seconds, they start making out with each other. which I think looks good. You know, so it's this process of like keeping some but not others. And yeah, if I had more time, who knows? Yeah, but a part of, I mean, Christoph, when he was giving this introduction, talked about this like aesthetic or this style. That's not something that I ever predetermined either, but it's just by minimizing everything that I'm working with and abstracting this world, it allows me to actually do a lot more, build bigger visions, because I don't have to worry about the perfect specular highlight on that Unreal Engine thing, you know. So yeah, I'm sort of defining my own rules, which is helpful and can incorporate glitch or just like laziness or whatever you want to call it. Thank you guys for coming. Yeah,